Hi, I'm Sean Stone. After another week of the spectacle of the theater of cruelty by Islamic jihadists, we ask the question, who's financing them? Stick around for Buzzsaw.
Central Intelligence Agency.
It was described by witnesses as...
Joining us today is a whistleblower who is a U.S. Army Special Operations Officer with the Psychological Operations Division. He's also been contracted for counterterrorism analysts to Booz Allen Hamilton. And he turned whistleblower for very particular and disturbing reasons. His name is Scott Bennett, and he's joining us now. Let's enter the buzzsaw. Scott, thank you for coming and engaging with us today. We've got a lot to cover. You've interacted with some famous characters, including Edward Snowden, in your career. And I think the best place to start is really at the beginning. What is the beginning of your military and contracting career under the U.S. government during the Bush administration? Let's just begin with that, and what kind of brought you in terms of your patriotism and wanting to serve.
Well, thank you, Sean, for having me on board. I'll go as quick as we can, so he's get as much information as I can. Nothing is classified. Nothing violates my oath as an officer is what I'm going to disclose here. I came out to Washington, D.C. in '98 because I wanted to get involved in political circles. I worked in the Republican National Committee. I worked at Leadership Institute, Heritage Foundation, all the conservative, Republican-oriented organizations. Was then put into the Bush administration for 2003 to 2008. I was picked out by a Colonel Jeff Jones to join a team that he was putting together on psychological warfare against Islamic extremism. Colonel Jeff Jones was a commander in special operations and PSYOP, one of the most famous men, brilliant thinkers, and I was very honored and I accepted the position. And I knew a lot of guys in the Army, and I worked with them in my Bush capacity doing various things for the administration. And they'd given me a direct commission, which is something, only given to doctors and lawyers and people with advanced degrees and such. But I had done a lot of work and research and writing on psychological warfare and Islamic theory and ideology. So I joined the Booz Allen Hamilton team, and then I was groomed into becoming an officer in the psychological warfare division. And I went down and did all my training and did all my assignment, and it was interesting, but I was also sadly disappointed. I saw a lot of the intellectual material sort of damp gunpowder. They didn't really have the creativity and the flexibility and the mossy ingenuity of Hollywood or advertising, which is what I was used to. I had grown up in California. I had worked at 20th Century Fox, and later on I worked at Dark Horse Comics, and then I worked in advertising in the Bay Area. So I was used to a different dynamic than the military structure. However, I joined the military to help them get their act together and infuse whatever creativity I could into their systems and operations and personnel. So I joined their team, and Colonel Jones made me liaison officer to the State Department Counterterrorism Office and Special Operations Command, which was quite a significant position because I saw basically and helped write and develop all of the psychological warfare platforms and systems and theories and papers that State Department used, that the embassies all over the world used, and that all of the psychological operations battalions and commands would use. And I was then picked after my State Department experience in SOCOM. I was picked by Dov Zakheim to go down to U.S. Central Command at MacDill Air Force Base and be a terrorist threat finance analyst, basically tracking all the money supply that the terrorists were using. And it was every terrorist under the sun, whoever was classified as terrorist. So you had every country in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Europe. And we were basically backtracking. A guy blows himself up. Where did he get the money to buy the dynamite? And we track it back, and a lot of it went to Swiss banks. A lot of it went to African, European banks. A lot of it went to Muslim charities in the United States. And my job was to track it and identify and develop profiles for kinetic operations. So guys that would be killed after being legitimately identified. And I was down at U.S. Central Command. I was also an officer in the reserves So I had to drill and all that stuff. So I picked up my life in Washington, moved down to Florida. And I won't go into the details of what I was doing down in Florida, but suffice it to say there was a lot of things that I came into conflict with involving Booz Allen Hamilton and their performance on the contract, which I think later has been proven to be contractor fraud and refusing to supply intelligence to the military commands when they asked for it. I gave lots and lots of talks and briefings and paper development and research, and I saw a lot of incompetence. So I was torn because I was a military guy at that time too. So I went through the whole indoctrination, the soldier creed, and I saw firsthand guys and girls getting blown up and their legs missing and their faces missing. And a lot of it I saw because of ineptitude and incompetence and dragging our feet. And Booz Allen Hamilton was hired to help remove those blockages. You know, the arterial sclerosis of the bureaucratic impediments in the military is equal, if not superior to that, is the federal government. So I called a lot of attention, but to make a long story short, I was fired from Booz Allen Hamilton. I was ensnared in a false arrest, and they invented a civilian case about me. Now, what I thought at the time, I thought it was a test because I was supposed to be deployed as a military officer overseas. I thought I was being tested by the top ranks of special operations. And I thought they're doing this to see my fortitude, to see my flexibility. So I endured what they were doing to me. And some of it was pretty painful and torturous, putting your hands behind your back in a seat with your arms raised in a jail cell, in a car with windows rolled up in Florida for 8 hours. I mean, things that were really agonizing. But I thought it was a test, because I thought there's no way this can be real. However, I later discovered it was real, and I blame Booz Allen Hamilton and Dov Zakheim and a few other parties for that. And I was basically, the military, I asked them to represent me. I said, I'm being charged with wearing my uniform and living on base and having property unregistered. All these civilian charges are illegal. They should charge me in a military court, if anything, and give me military counsel, because it seems like they don't think I'm a real military officer. The military refused to give me any defense counsel, which I thought, that's very strange. Maybe this is a test too. But I went to court. I thought everything was going to be thrown out. I thought someone was going to walk in a black suit any second and say, this is dismissed, this is an operation. Next thing I know, I go through a lightning speed jury trial, and I'm found guilty of making a false statement on a housing form. They had invented all sorts of false stuff about me, and a lot of the stuff was invented by CIA personnel, and I found that out later. But they threw me up into a prison in Pennsylvania. They took me right out of the courtroom, shackled me, and threw me up into a prison in Pennsylvania after a hellish ride of 5-6 months and all sorts of, bad prisons. And again, I thought maybe this was all part of the test. I enlisted for a reason. Maybe they're doing this for some grand operation. They sure as hell better pay me when they tell me about it.
Well, you're a PsyOps guy, so you're probably looking at it like they must be testing my psyche somehow, right, to see when I'm going to break.
Absolutely. And they get me up to Pennsylvania, and then I'm every day I'm writing in pencil on toilet paper tissue and sending out to family. Then I get to a final typewriter, no computers, but a typewriter, and I start writing all this down. And when I get to Pennsylvania, about 30 pounds lighter, I meet the Swiss banker named Brad Birkenfeld. And Brad Birkenfeld was huge because he was the equivalent of the goose that laid the golden egg. I had been looking at Swiss banks and European banks and all sorts of terrorist financing trails in Florida and MacDill. And when I ran into Brad Birkenfeld, he and I just started comparing notes, and it was sort of just ran into each other. And he told me his story, which blew me away. And that was, he had been a Swiss banker in Geneva and came over to the United States after the CIA had targeted him, got him into a false DUI, the same thing they did to me, got him into a false DUI. An agent came into his cell, flashed his CIA badge, and then started to try and groom him for an intelligence material. And Brad got wind of that and fled to the United States. Now, what's significant is Edward Snowden, was part of that operation in Geneva. He reported it to Glenn Greenwald, Andrew Fishman, and observed what they did to Birkenfeld. That was, quote, one of the turning points for Snowden. And I contacted Glenn Greenwald and Andrew Fishman later, and they asked me, did I have proof? And I said I did, documented from Brad Birkenfeld himself. And they never responded after that. They never contacted me again, which causes a red flag to go up. So you don't know who you're dealing with. You don't know who's being paid or who's really interested in the glory or the money. But judge people by their actions. And I judged Andrew Fishman and Glenn Greenwald by their refusal to draw this connection between Edward Snowden and Brad Birkenfeld.
So now, had you come across Snowden before that point?
Well, I had known of him in Hawaii in some of the operations, because a lot of the people that I worked with in PSYOP and SOCOM and State Department went over to Hawaii and Cyber Command. So I had been part of their conferences and leadership teams and thinking a lot of the projects through that they were doing. So I won't go into the details about my connection or knowledge of him, because a lot of bad guys who are out there trying to still combat me and keep a lot of this out, I don't want to reveal anything about that, because I also don't want to jeopardize Brad Birkenfeld or Snowden. But suffice it to say, I was fully aware of everything that he was doing and his teammates.
At what point, I was going to ask, at what point did, at that time, you obviously thought it was some kind of PSYOP that was being run against you until you end up in a jail. At what point did you realize, I must have crossed a red line somewhere? I must have basically, what was your offense? What was your great offense, basically, that demanded this kind of retaliation and punishment for you?
Well, I think there's two schools of thought. Barbara Honegger and Susan Lindauer, and a lot of others have said, Scott, you were set up purposely to go in there and find Birkenfeld and find his materials and provide it, because no one else could. No one else was being allowed to reveal it, and maybe no one else had the capability. I'm sort of known as a pit bull, as aggressive, as a digger, and I don't back down. That can get me into some trouble sometimes, but the people who knew me in the military and intel circles always said, if you want something done, go send Bennett in. If you want, the guy's fearless, he'll attack anything he sees, and that's what I do. That's what I did. We were in a war. We were in a time clock operation where soldiers were getting killed, and we only had a limited amount of time before we ran out of money, we ran out of good PR, and the rest of the world started turning against us. That's how I looked at this. So my enthusiasm and motivation was to get in, give as much as I could, fight this as hard as I could, and run the race like a sprint, not a jog. And that's where a lot of the military personnel and the contractors, they treat it like a jog. They don't look to extinguish the fire. They simply look to sort of keep it smoldering. And I think they get paid as a result. That's the issue with contracting in general, right? Is how much that these guys are making as profiteers of war. That's what they are. Yeah, they're profiteers. And my school of thought had always been different. I never went into politics or the military or contracting to be paid endlessly, to live fat. I went in, as bizarre as it may seem, but I went in to work myself out of a job. I went in to finish and end a war so that I could go back to my crops and my family and the sunny world of California, as General Maximus may have said in Gladiator. Everybody else wanted to stay in the cushy life of wearing the uniform, being a bureaucrat, moving paper around, and not really doing anything, but sucking the American taxpayer dry in the process. I was never like that, and I never will be. But if you were sent then, I mean, if that theory is correct, and you were sent basically to prison to basically connect with Birkenfeld and sort of get reconnaissance in a sense, wouldn't that then be a faction that was looking to find out more about the financial connections and ties? Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, if you wear that hat, I could very easily see. I mean, it would have been a brilliant operation, and they picked the right guy to do it, because I didn't back down, and I kept digging. I mean, I jumped in. I was in prison, and my ears are always open. I'm in mission mode, and I'm gathering intel, and I discover Birkenfeld, and I sit down with him, and he opens up his book, all these documents, 24,000 bank accounts, WikiLeaks cables, Department of Justice letters that indicate, a false case against him, Lenikoff, all these big clients, big Hollywood clients, and big, political clients. Senator Phil Gramm, John Boehner, all these guys with Swiss bank accounts, who I don't have a problem naming names, and I intend to appear before a congressional committee and expand that name list. But I dug all that stuff out with Birkenfeld, and I said, Brad, you won't believe this, but I was looking for you when I was in the military down at U.S. Central Command. How come I never heard of you? And he said, Scott, no one in a military uniform or in the intelligence community ever sat down and debriefed me. I tried to get out to Carl Levin. Barack Obama was on the Carl Levin committee at the time, and I tried to get all this material out, but I was shut down by Eric Holder and Lanny Brewer. They wouldn't let me talk to anybody. They wouldn't let me talk to the military. They wouldn't let me talk to DIA or CIA. Now, of course, DIA and CIA knew perfectly well that Birkenfeld existed, but officially, he wasn't given that ability to talk and expose because, he would have been exonerated for a lot of things. And that led me to believe that there was a major cover-up. And then Brad always said, Lanny Brewer and Eric Holder worked for Covington and Burling. That was the firm that represented Union Bank of Switzerland. That's why they prosecuted him. That's why they gave them a non-prosecution agreement to UBS. That's why they only fined them 2% of their profit over a year, which came to if you're a taxpayer making $50,000, your fine was like 25 or 50 bucks or whatever, $1,000. I can't remember the calculation we did. But it was obscene. So Brad and I put all this together. We funneled a letter to U.S. Central Command James Mattis, and Brad said, I'm the UBS whistleblower. All this material that you need to fight the war on terror and combat terrorist financing, I have. Please debrief me immediately. And I want to bring in Scott Bennett, who's a terrorist finance analyst previously with Booz Allen Hamilton, who can confirm a lot of my material is genuine and that is essential to the war mission. And we sent that out August 1st, 2012. On September 11th, 2012, a little over a month, Brad was paid $104 million. And that September 11th, 2012 is the same day as Benghazi.
Right.
A lot of CIA speculators have said they did that intentionally because the Benghazi Birkenfeld shell game was to divert attention away from that big payment and cause people to dig up what was going on. And Jesselyn Raddick represented Brad Birkenfeld. She did his wiki page and PR, according to Brad. And now she also represents Edward Snowden. So Brad had said to me, get in contact with Jesselyn Raddick, get in contact with Cohn, and Colapinto, my attorneys, and provide them with what you can provide that substantiates my Swiss bank terrorist finance connection.
Right.
And I did that. And no one, not any of those lawyers, ever responded to me and refused to debrief me. And what I think was happening was they just wanted him paid. They just wanted to collect the money, and they didn't care about the military dimensions, the war dimensions, the soldiers that are killed, these Swiss banks that have been continuing since 2012, actually before, 24,000 of them, and some of which, are billions and billions of dollars that have gone to a lot of the bad guys you see in ISIS, black operations there. Now, Jesselyn Raddick also works for or represents Edward Snowden. So here you've got Jesselyn Raddick representing Snowden and Brad Birkenfeld and me right in the middle. Connected to Snowden through Booz Allen Hamilton and the military. Snowden went into special forces, broke his legs in a training jump. Brad Birkenfeld connected to me through terrorist financing work and prison. And just combining it all and then bringing in Julian Assange because his WikiLeaks cables were all exposures of the State Department Counterterrorism Office where I worked. The State Department Counterterrorism Office focusing on Birkenfeld to cover him up, to silence him, to gain political advantage with the Swiss and send Chinese Uyghurs from Guantanamo over there and get all sorts of benefits and treaties and all that. So the skullduggery and the corruption is all there, It just has never been exposed and put on the table, but it soon will be.
Well, let's start doing that. Basically, we know obviously these Swiss bank accounts are secretive, right? And so the idea is always, well, we can't trace and know where the money ultimately comes from. In your analysis, talking to Birkenfeld, your experience before that, who are the major financiers of the modern jihad that we're looking at? The ISIS groups.
One of the biggest ones was Abdullah Aziz, Osama bin Laden's brother. Also, you had a group of Saudis and Kuwaitis and Qataris who had Swiss bank accounts, all of which were being funneled through groups like the Optimus Foundation, which was a UBS internal organization, and a lot of sub-level money laundering mechanisms that process this money into just a long sort of river. It's sort of like if you look at it like the top of a mountain and all that snow comes down into 1,000 little creeks and rivers. That's where you had Swiss banks, UBS, as the top of the mountain, and it had all sorts of little levies and docks and internal organizations that financed and filtered all this money that got down into Kuwait, Qatar, Yemen, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, besides the Iranian banks and things like that. So you had a lot of just Swiss bank accounts. You also had a lot of CIA bank accounts in UBS that had been, the combinations had been changed. So a lot of CIA money that had been in there had been changed and stolen from. There's two schools in the CIA. You have the domestic CIA, and then you have the international CIA, and they don't talk to each other. So one Paul steals money from Peter, if you will. And you had a lot of money there. And a lot of that will be exposed in the court documents and filings that will involve Dov Zakheim and others. They'll be brought in as material witnesses because the case against me, the criminal case, is still pending. And all of these people and activities I'm going to bring in as material witnesses and subpoena to testify that what they did to me was to cover up all this stuff that I found out later. And I anticipate when all of that material is demanded, every email, every letter, every phone call, that matrix is going to yield proof that Dov Zakheim is intimately connected with the Saudi financing of ISIS and ISIL through UBS Swiss banks, and Brad Birkenfeld and Snowden and Assange will testify to the materials that are relevant to that. And to a certain degree, they will be exonerated because the American public would see that as, guys trying to do the patriotic thing. Brad tried to do the patriotic thing. I tried to do the patriotic thing. Snowden tried to do the patriotic thing. He did a little bit differently. I mean, he took material and shot it up, a lot of which we haven't seen because they haven't released it, a lot of which is directly connected to Birkenfeld's material. That's what they're very hesitant or scared of. I don't think Greenwald's got the guts to release that because he's afraid he's going to get killed. But it's all going to come out. So,
obviously people hear the Saudis financing terrorism, and they're not yet getting the connection. There's something missing here. Remember, we have the 28 pages missing from the 9/11 Commission report. People like Bob Graham are saying, divulge those pages. There are literally congressmen like Walter Jones saying there's treasonous material here because not only are we talking about the Saudis, again, we're talking about a Saudi family that was very close, as we know, to the Bush family, for example, and many of these neocons like Dov Zakheim. So, is this what you've basically come to understand, is that it's not just Saudis financing, but it literally does tie back to these people like your former boss, Dov Zakheim, who are protecting them?
Well, it's the Saudis, it's the Kuwaitis, it's the Qataris, it's the royal families in all of those countries. And the highest levels of the government officials are the royal families. I mean, they appoint their nephews and their cousins to positions in the highest levels of government in Kuwait and Qatar. And Saudi is obviously the best known one. So there's a very incestuous relationship. It's part of the incestuousness of the culture overall. The Middle Eastern Arab mentality has a certain sadisticness to it, a certain incestuousness. There's a loose sloppiness. There's a warm weather sort of banana republic. Let's all just bathe and take a siesta in the sunshine, which is quite alien to the classical, American, pioneer gumption and spirit and strength. And that comes out in a lot of the Saudi contracting of their work, their military work to the United States. Now we've taken it all up and we've planted our flags in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Kuwait, because we want this big influence, but they don't have any loyalty to us. They're interested in preserving themselves. What we're going to see is a lot of the big rich Saudi donors who gave money are documented and tracked in the UBS Swiss bank accounts that Birkenfeld had, that I have, that have been shared and buried and duplicated and represented to council. So there's nothing that, if anything happened to me, they would still be preserved and they would be released come hell or high water, even if it was done as, my last will and testament. I've got everything that I need to get out. But we will see very shortly with the revelations of Moussaoui and some of these court actions in New York, who I've been in contact with the attorneys who are doing the prosecutions of the Swiss banks on behalf of the soldier families in the 2nd District of New York. All of that will come out and all of these accounts will be relevant. And then you will see in my particular case, you'll see all the politicians who were informed about this and refused to do anything about it. You will see the military people who were informed about this. I reported my material up the chain of command specifically out of respect to the Constitution and the military hierarchy. I sent my materials as a whistleblowing report, which you probably have seen on the webpage and in the book Shell Game, to General Jeff Jacobs, who was commander of U.S. Civil Affairs Psychological Operations Command, General Martin Dempsey, General Ray Odierno, the Inspector General Lynn Halbrooks, and then a plethora of senators and congressmen: John Boehner, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, Howard Buck McKeon, Chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Dianne Feinstein,
and
the Armed Services Committee.
No responses?
Not a single response. Not one person out of like 200 letters.
Well, what about like Bob Graham or Walter Jones? Because obviously they've been pursuing the 28 pages release disclosure. Nothing.
And I'll probably keep that a little bit in the dark until I go through all the documentation to see where they stand, what they have, because I don't want to damage them if they've had a, quote, come to Jesus moment, if they've discovered that all this is an avalanche waiting to fall and they're trying to get on the right side. I'll give them that chance. I will give any senator and congressman a chance to say, I never knew this. I never saw it. What happened? How did you go to prison? My God, this is a tragedy. Let's look at this. Let's examine this. Let's bring this all out. My only condition it'll be brought out in public. None of this will be classified because everything that I've reported came to me from the whistleblower himself. And that was unclassified, and I am revealing it to the American public because I want mothers and fathers whose sons who died in Iraq and Afghanistan, I want them to know this and hold their public officials accountable, especially the ones who've known about this since 2012.
Well, what about those who have known about it earlier? I mean, that's, I think, where it gets very interesting, this question.
Yeah, well, those people should be shot, and the later ones should be simply imprisoned, if you will, but I won't go to those extremes, but I want it fully known who knew about this, because, again, people are dead because of it. That's the seriousness. You've got American soldiers that are dead, and it's not a romantic notion. It's you don't join in the military to go fight a war that's being financed by banks and individuals that your own government knows about and facilitates and processes. Now, part of the justification of the intelligence circles is that we are creating ISIS and these mercenary Muslim groups who are as wild and crazy as drunken donkeys. We're creating them so that they can go and destabilize Syria and destabilize the external countries and political hierarchies in the countries that are surrounding, Israel and the Middle East, so that we weaken those countries so badly that they're incapable of any major military offensive against the United States or Israel. That's part of the argument,
right?
The neoconservative argument. I don't buy it because, they're nomads in a sense, so breaking up the political nexus or the nest doesn't really have an effect on them if they're used to nomadic warfare and nomadic existence and things related to that. I think a big part of it is trying to weaken and destabilize Russia and eventually, put them in a losing, on the defensive. I think that's going to have enormous blowback, though. I think that we have calculated that wrong because we've had a lot of stupid people in the neoconservative camp thinking that you can replace Islamic religious or any religious impulse. You can replace that with capitalism and democracy and MTV and alcohol and video games, and somehow all of that is going to fill the vacuum which was previously occupied by the religious impulse. And that's a very ignorant calculation that we see, being proven for the last 10 years. One of my great professors at Catholic University was Klaus Rinn, and he wrote about this in 2003 in a book called America the Virtuous, in which he chastised the ignorance of the neoconservative camp because they had miscalculated this whole war agenda. This is 2003, 2004, and he laid it all out, how bad this was going to get. And 10 years later, it's bad, if not worse, than what he predicted.
Right. Well, I think it's getting worse, but predictably so, by many people who saw basically what was happening with the destabilization of the Middle East intentionally, beginning with the Iraq War in particular,
Yes.
as basically the first step of what was called, remember, the 30 Years War in Europe, right? Where you basically have sectarian violence across nations and the destruction of nation states. And this has all been prophesied by the PNAC guys like Dov Zakheim and people like Tony Blair in the British Empire, who said we are no longer dealing with nation states, right? So what we're doing is we're shattering nation states. That's what the New World Order is about. Let's destroy. Oh, Iraq is a strong sovereign nation, even though it may have a brutal dictator, but ultimately it's a nation. Let's destroy it. Syria has a sovereign nation under Assad. Okay, let's destroy that. I mean, and that's kind of the New World Order mentality. We can deal, we can negotiate deals with tribes. We can still profit off of war by selling, by selling weapons to particular tribes to defend themselves, and then making deals for access to oil fields or whatnot, or certain minerals, resources, right? Kind of like what Africa has become. I mean, people forget that Africa has got millions of people dead in the Congo Civil War, and white people are freaking out about people getting decapitated in the Middle East, and yet we ignore how many millions have died in Africa as a result of these same policies, which ultimately are about empire.
Well, you provide a brilliant psychological warfare analysis, Sean, because you hit it right on the money, and that is the behaviors that are triggered by mental imagery that is implanted in these people. And it's like, everybody's a blender, and when you pour a certain liquid in there and mix it with others, it's going to have this whole effect. Now, the Muslim mind is a different sort of blender than the American mind because of the cultural history that America has from Britain to Germany to the Greeks and the Romans. Western civilization is entirely different in its internal filtration and its whole gestation of ideas than the Muslim mind. And there's a lot more totalitarianism and authoritarianism. But here's the key. These Muslim minds want that. They want that authority and that totalitarian grip and control because it has ties to the religious hierarchy, the muftis and the clerics and that whole school of thought. And when you take that off, when you take that control, that authority off, it goes into panic and chaos, and the brute thugs and the rapist roaring gangs and the thugs all come to power. Look at Tripoli. Look at what happened to Libya.
Well, yeah, I mean, but again, how much is this being, as we say, financed by American sources? And I want to get back now to the real question, which is 9/11. Based on your years of experience and what the evidence that you've come across, you seem to believe now that there was an inside hand or inside job element to the 9/11 attacks.
Well, it's an incredible story, and I the only sadness I have is that I was so ignorant for so long. But the redemption is, God opens your eyes in certain times and later on, and I had to go through this whole metamorphosis. I had to be part of the hardcore right wing. I had to be part of the hardcore warrior culture before I could transition and discover, from the caterpillar to the butterfly. I had to make that, that the whole processing of the cocoon, and the cocoon was sort of prison, where I came across Joe Naccio, who was the Quest Communications president, who had all sorts of intel on 9/11 and NSA, and that's why they threw him in prison. Brad Birkenfeld, Swiss banks, terrorist financing, a lot of guys who knew a lot of stuff about 9/11.
I went to meet Naccio when he was in prison in Pennsylvania. And he had been approached by the NSA before the attacks to start wiretaps, basically, right, using his communications company to begin assisting the government with intelligence gathering and whatnot. And he refused.
Yeah, he refused, and that's why they prosecuted him. They also stabbed his son in the arm, a couple guys in suits in Georgetown. Say hi to your dad for us. And, nobody reports that, knows about it. Michael Hastings received all this material, Shell Game, the Birkenfeld materials, the reports, and he was looking into the connection between Psychological Command, McChrystal, who I worked under at U.S. Central Command. Michael Hastings was looking into a lot of this, and it was part of his connection to Brennan and CIA and the senior CIA NSA officials who were all in their positions during the time of Snowden and WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, and Birkenfeld in 2006 to 2009. And Hastings was looking into all that, and I simply provided the connections and the materials. And we look what happened to him. But you have to engage this as a fight. You have to be fearless, not reckless or suicidal, but you have to cover yourself and have everything buried. And if anything happens, the bad guys know they're not going to shut you up. All of this is going to come out even worse if they do anything to you.
Well, I was going to ask you, given your investigations into the finance of terrorism, did you ever come across any explanation for what happened to that $2 trillion that went missing from the Pentagon that was announced, I think, the day before 9/11? And Dov Zakheim was the controller of the Pentagon at that time?
Yeah, I know exactly where it is and what happened to it. I want to keep that. I want to keep that covert and maintained, though, so we can talk about that another time as the principal legal actions are developed, and I'm sure you'll understand that.
But does that tie into the 9/11 attacks?
Yeah. Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, Booz Allen Hamilton, the major contractor that I worked for, that was owned by the Carlyle Group, that also ran the security clearance operation.
The Carlyle Group, of course, had the bin Laden family on the board with the Bush family, meeting the same morning of 9/11 attacks.
That's right. So the Carlyle Group owns Booz Allen Hamilton, and it also owns the company that provides the security clearances that Booz Allen Hamilton needs. So it's a brother and sister relationship. As abominable hills have eyes as that may appear, that's the reality. The other thing is Booz Allen Hamilton has an entire floor with every secret document the American government has. And no one knows that, but Booz Allen Hamilton people with top secret clearances can go in there and have all their fun looking into Pandora's box and give it to appropriate parties. So that's another thing that I want known in a congressional hearing and an investigation that the members have covered up and hidden. The 9/11 connection, I discovered and was schooled and came out and learned all this stuff after my military experience. And it's sad because so many military guys are willfully ignorant and they're not worthy calling themselves soldiers or wearing the uniform. They are traitors to this country. However, that being said, there are noble men who have worn the uniform, who, upon discovery of this, have stood up as soldiers, as officers, as enlisted men, and said, this is a violation of my country at the deepest level, and I'm going to announce it to my fellow citizens who don't wear the uniform, and I'm going to share it with my fellow soldiers and Marines and airmen and seamen to expand this conversation and get it known. These men need to be held to account. These internal detonations that were in the building and the Pentagon attacks in particular should, and I think will, as this comes out more and more and more, offend everybody who's ever worn the uniform, and everybody currently wearing the uniform, I think you could easily have a French Revolution trigger because this whole thing was based on a lie. And people have died and lost everything they've had for a lie, and it's still being treated as a lie. All these military whistleblowers are being prosecuted and jumped on and buried, and I think that's going to stop because this is approaching a Yellowstone geyser moment. It can't be contained any longer. It's taken 10 years, but it can't be contained any longer.
Would you say the motive for the 9/11 attacks was principally to begin this war on terror in the Middle East and basically a perpetual war that allows for more authoritarian power to occur in this country? Or do you think it was also or largely based upon the idea some people have put forth that it was there was basically there were financial shenanigans that had taken place for the last 20, 30 years at least, going that actually had some ties to the Iran-Contra operation, remember, which also had Swiss bank accounts for these Oliver North, CIA agents, private bank accounts and whatnot, where a lot of this money had been diverted to. But the point being that there were financial shenanigans involving the Bush family and their counterparts, that the evidence basically was being held in those World Trade Center 7, as well as in that branch of the Pentagon, which was, I think, the accounting department and the Office of Naval Intelligence. That was the branch that was hit. So basically, there was something that particular. Also, Cantor Fitzgerald was the company that got mainly hit at World Trade Center. If you look at, there were only 2 or 3 companies that got really hit. Euro Brokers, Cantor Fitzgerald. They lost 1,000 employees, or I'm sorry, 500 plus employees, whereas most other companies didn't lose that many. So, do you think it was more financial motivation, or ultimately geostrategic, perpetual war, as PNAC called for, like a new Pearl Harbor?
Well, it could be both. It could have dovetailed. I mean, they've been planning this for a long period of time. The Muslim Middle East personality since the 1920s. I mean, since the Barbary Coast pirates, even before, they've always been labeled a unstable, mentally, explosive culture and personality, which makes them good scapegoats for any sort of bad behavior. That explosive dynamite's always been kept under control to a certain degree. It's been kept under control because of the hierarchies of the royal families and the Saudi Arabians and the Qataris and the Kuwaits. So they control their people. The financial shenanigans of Building 7 and Enron and things relating to all the things that you've listed are still unfolding, still coming out. The 28 pages that are going to be hopefully, demanded to be released, as well as other intelligence. I think it'll show, yes, that there were financial games that were going on and financial thievery that was going on, and the 9/11 attack just happened to blow up and destroy a couple buildings that were worthless, that were insured beyond measure, and Building 7 had all of the CIA intelligence documentation inside of it that miraculously came down after a couple papers lit and started an office fire. We've seen that in the 9/11 engineers and scientists and architects and all that coming out, showing that it was impossible for these buildings to have gone down in the way that the official story tells us. So when we start out from the forensic scientific analysis like a murder scene, and that would be a hell of a Criminal Minds episode if they had the gall and the gumption and the patriotism to re-examine the 9/11 attacks. But if you look at it from a forensic analysis point of view and you come back, you see that they were destroyed by internal detonation. You see that the firefighters heard explosions and they were wounded and a few of them were killed. You see the pouring red hot metal coming out from the thermite that was high up in one of the trade towers. And you see Building 7 coming down. And you say, that happened artificially. It was not a couple planes, it was something more. Then you come back and say, why was it done? We know what happened, now why? And then you start looking into what was in all those buildings. Yeah. And then you say, well, who was connected to all that stuff? And then you see Dov Zakheim and Rudy Giuliani and Silverstein, and you see a lot of funny characters. Susan Lindauer has talked extensively on that, has a lot of good material. Barbara Honegger has too, and I've sat down and talked with them at great lengths, and they are brilliant ladies, as well as a variety of other people. And you come back and saying, well, and then you start seeing who was involved and what did they benefit from? And my experience and the money side is, it's fascinating because I see all this meshing, and I see it mesh with things I knew involving silver bullion coins in Thailand and buried under airports, and things that were sent to New York and wire transfers and certificates printed in Hong Kong that were worthless by the time they arrived in New York. And the guy's getting prosecuted for wire fraud to do that, who did that, to cover up the whole story. And meetings in Panama involving Cheney and Bush, and meetings in Wyoming, the stuff you couldn't make up. And that's what's encouraging. It's very sad, it's very outrageous, but it's also encouraging because you see and you go, my God, if the American person knew all this stuff, they would hang Cheney and Bush, and Bush Sr. too. They would hang them from the highest trees. They would hang Rumsfeld. They would hang General Myers, who I knew. They would hang Martin Dempsey and Ray Odierno because they can't escape with plausible deniability.
Right.
They work for the government. They work for the people. They have an obligation and a duty to represent these people.
Unfortunately, they don't recognize that, and they are, matter of fact, authoritarians. And I think it's interesting you mentioned the Muslim mind respecting authoritarians, because actually, I mean, the Western world really still respects authoritarianism, and we just hide it behind a lot of mass entertainment and that we call democratic. But really, the only democracy is on TV and which TV shows you choose to watch. Yeah. It's not in terms of who's ruling your country.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and I saw that firsthand in the Nazi Gestapo treatment of the Department of Justice and what they did to Birkenfeld, what they did to Nacho, what they did to me. I mean, I was a precedent. I'm the first person in the United States history who was in uniform doing duties as a function of his military calling. I was the first person who was charged in a civilian court for what I was doing for the military. The military should have come in and said, whoa, you can't do that to Bennett.
Right.
If you do it to him, you do it to every single military soldier, past and present.
Yeah.
And the military didn't do that. That's a sign that the military in this country has become so effeminate and corrupt and neutered and bureaucratic that they just don't have the gumption to protect soldiers. And if you lose that camaraderie, well then, I mean, look at what's happening now. You've got guys serving in uniform who were so afraid of being aggressive, being soldiers, that they're dying and losing men in the process of that fear. Like the movie that was done, Soul Survivor or Lone Survivor.
Oh, right, exactly. Well, I think, the sad thing is that we forget that the soldier's oath is to serve from enemies domestic and abroad. And domestic is the key. And the problem is that, there are not enough men like you who are willing to stand up to the domestic enemy that we know is in power.
Let me read you the Soldier's Creed, Sean. You may know this, but this explains, why I did what I did. And every soldier hearing your show should stand up and support you getting this out. The Soldier's Creed says, I am an American soldier. I am a warrior and a member of a team. I serve the people of the United States and live the Army values. I will always place the mission first. I will never accept defeat. I will never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade. I am disciplined, physically and mentally tough, trained and proficient in my warrior tasks and skills. I always maintain my arms, my equipment, and myself. I am an expert and I am a professional. I stand ready to deploy, engage, and destroy the enemies of the United States of America in close combat. I am a guardian of freedom and the American way of life. I am an American soldier. What I saw was a threat to the freedom and the American way of life. What I saw with Birkenfeld and Nacho was a threat to the freedom and the American way of life. And I filed whistleblowing reports as a military officer to my senior commanders and my senior leaders in Congress, and not one person ever responded. They should all be tried for treason for that.
Well, not yet, but again, I expect more to come out soon and more to follow. So we'll leave it at that. But I think the history of this entire time period is yet to be written. The real history of what has happened post-2000, 2001 to this country, and internally, domestically, and externally, who is really in charge and running this fraud, a hoax of a war on terror.
Yes. Well, thank you for having the courage to do this, because so few people are willing to do it, Sean. I'm inspired that you've got the strength and the character, and I think your father would be proud.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you so much for joining us and speaking with us. So hopefully we'll have more to come within this year.
Thank you, Sean. We will.
All right. Thanks, Scott.
God bless.
Well, they have it, folks. We're just trying to remind you, in any incident, stop reacting with the fear-based mind and think about cui bono, who benefits from all of these terrorist incidents and attacks across the world, and start to realize that the enemy is much closer to home than abroad. This is Sean Stone signing off.